information sector in Whatcom County? What's the average salary there?
Oh, closer to 70,000.
So you get an idea of the spread we're talking about when we look at this chart. When I look at this chart, I often look at the average, the blue bars, the total wages, and that orange bar with the percent of total employment. And the more equalized they are, the closer they are to average, if you will, when you see those average numbers for the state. And so like government's very average, which is, you know, we'd expect that because a lot of government is going to be school teachers, and that's fairly regulated across the state. But you can see where sectors vary quite a bit away from state average in both total number of employment and total wages.
Well, and I highlighted healthcare and social assistance because it's an easy category to talk about with this group. Nearly 13% of the jobs in the state are in healthcare and social assistance, and people think, oh, it's got to be a high-paying sector. Think about what physicians make and so on, but the average pay is $53,500. So only about 9% of the overall wages or earnings in the state come in that sector. 13% of the jobs, less than 10% of the wages, because so many people are in the home health, visiting angels, nurses, skilled nursing facilities, and so on, where the pay is not so high. So two of the more misunderstood sectors, I think, are healthcare, and then everybody thinks about manufacturing. Boeing, right? It's now down closer to 8% of the jobs. Less than 3% of the jobs in the state are in transportation equipment manufacturing, which includes Boeing. About 9% of the wages earned to manufacturing has really slipped, while retail with Amazon, information with Microsoft, a number of other companies. 4 or 5% of the jobs are in information. That's totally a Seattle story. It's less than 1% in Whatcom County, most counties. So I'll move on. Trying to give some context. James and I'll talk a little bit to this slide, just in case we were to share our slides, we put something up there. Because yes, we're going to be talking about the impacts of COVID-19, and we're going to reference gross domestic product, or GDP. We'll talk about unemployment, and we have to remember that aggregate numbers like GDP are really problematic because different people across the state experience the economy in such different ways, and GDP doesn't capture any of that variation. We can talk about unemployment by county, and you have to remember that unemployment, you have to be looking for work to be counted as unemployed. Or you could be employed part-time looking for a full-time job, but you're counted as employed, and so on. So the data are a problem. The data that we get is also lagged. It's last week's or last month's survey data.
Sometimes last quarter.
And that really messes us up right now when things are changing. And I'll come back to the scale or the magnitude of the numbers in just a moment. As we look ahead, remembering that the economy is always changing. Think about how we're having this meeting now compared to how you had your meetings this past winter or fall. So we'll come back to those topics. In this particular graphic, I'm showing the upper picture just to get you thinking about place. Half of the population in the United States lives in 146 counties. So we have about 3,100 counties, parishes, and boroughs, depending on what state you're in. Half of our population lives in 146. And economic activity is actually even more concentrated than that. So the other map with the yellow areas are showing essentially where all the job growth has happened. Well over a third of the job growth has basically since this last recession happened in the 20 largest metro areas. And then we can obviously peel back the inequality within a given metro area. But just thinking about place is crucial, and we often don't talk about that as much as we should. Picture on the left is unemployment claims. And you can see that in late March, we had 6.5 million, when we're used to having several 100,000. And you can't take, again, it's a group of you are used to working with models, and you know that you can't have a model that's calibrated for numbers in the hundreds or thousands and then all of a sudden throw in 6.5 million and have the output be meaningful. So we're really struggling. And unemployment insurance claims, those are people that have just been furloughed. They're not counted yet in the unemployment ranks, but that's what's coming. And it's really making a mess of how we think about unemployment. Is the unemployment rate going to spike up to 14, 15% maybe? So we're really wrestling with how to measure, because I don't know how to count somebody who's been furloughed with a job waiting, somebody else who's been furloughed, somebody's paying their health care, somebody else who's been laid off. But they're all right now count as exactly the same. They're not the same.
This is the challenge with this 6.6 million or 14% or whatever number you want to throw at this, is that we really don't know what that means. Because and I'm going to make numbers up, so these aren't real numbers. If I told you 60% of the people that are unemployed are unemployed on standby, which means their employer has said that, yes, you're going to come back and you have a job as soon as this clears back up, you're going to come back. Or if I said 30% of those people are on standby, it changes the math significantly as far as what we should expect. And unfortunately, the data is just not available. We've asked for it. It's just Employment Security is a little bit busy trying to process all these people. So they're not in a big hurry to give us the data point, which we understand. But it changes how we might think about how the recovery works. Because if a large percentage of people are on standby, the recovery could look nearly as sharp. If they're on unemployment and not on standby, then it could take longer.
Lurking in the background is a very worrisome oil market.
You mean free oil's not a good news? I thought you had to get paid to buy gas.
Free, yeah, exactly. Nowhere to put the stuff. The worry with, on one hand, the collapse in the price of oil is great. I mean, people aren't using oil, air quality improves, so on and so forth. Problems are what happens to the businesses that are only viable economically or financially at $40 or $50 a barrel. We've had a number of years of companies, especially in the shale regions of Texas, who've stayed in business because they've been able to constantly refinance their debt at lower and lower interest rates, not because they're generating a profit. And the Saudis and the Russians are having a good time trying to put them out of business. And so there's this backstory in the oil markets that deserves watching. And then I threw up a graph that talks about the S&P 500, what's happening to corporate earnings versus price to earnings ratio. Some people say, oh my God, stock market went up 20-something% last week. It's got to be nuts. If anybody happens to have questions, I put that graphic there. And I don't want to steer the conversation towards finances and equity markets or credit markets, but happy to talk about that to the extent that anyone's interested.
Hart, I'm curious. We don't rehearse this beforehand, so you guys get to see us sputter back and forth at each other. I'm curious, how much do you think that what we're seeing going on in the oil market would have happened without COVID versus with? Or are people taking advantage of a messy time in the financial markets and in the marketplace in general to go after some targeting? Because the Saudis and the Russia, they have been very diligent about trying to shut down the U.S. oil production.
You saw it in 2016, and oil got to $20-something a barrel, and this was attempt number 2. It was happening in January, early February, pre-COVID, and then the COVID impacts with people not driving mean that instead of having $25 a barrel oil that might push people in Texas out of business, all of a sudden there's nowhere to store the stuff. And oil that's been coming in on a contract that says, all right, James, you have to take delivery of this tanker of oil in April or May, and you're saying, I don't want it. You're actually having to pay somebody to take it. That's the negative price of oil, or a zero price. So this story was happening anyway. It's just multiplied because of COVID.
And is it possible that some businesses will take advantage of this in the recovery? I'm thinking like the Southwest Airlines story after 9/11, where they were able to buy fuel very inexpensively for years and be able to offer much lower fares than their competitors. Do you think that'll help in the recovery for some businesses?
If the price stays low, sure. A couple of airlines actually had hedges buying oil, but they were going to be willing to pay 20 or 30. So they're having to pay 20 or $30 right now when oil's even cheaper. So, oops. So here we are with a national outlook. This was the most recent numbers. It's now a couple of weeks old from the blue chip consensus. They've revised it down since then. There's a couple of things when you're hearing economic numbers in the news and it says we're expecting a 16% drop in GDP this quarter. That really means they're expecting GDP to drop 4% this quarter. And if you thought about that on an annualized basis, that would be closer to 16%. Just for perspective, we're looking at drops that are on par with the financial crisis, and in some sectors, worse.
But the recovery in Q3 and Q4 is much sharper.
Yes, that's the hope. So when somebody says unemployment going to 30%, that's something bad in a quarter or two, but then annualized. And sometimes you have to remember how to digest some of those numbers. When the economy stops and you're trying to sell things, oil is the perfect example. You have a deflationary pressures. I'm now going to lower my price and lower my price and lower my price, trying to get rid of this stuff. But probably a little bit of inflation coming in the near future. People having to pay off debt. People, workers wanting demanding higher wages to pay off some of their debt, et cetera, et cetera. It'll be a question of which companies can raise their prices.
Well, and supply chain too, right? Because the supply chain is going to, my non-business wife today, and we were talking about supply chain and what happens with the supply chain, which we're going to have I believe next Friday, we're going to have a webinar just on supply chain, if that makes you interested. But the supply chain is getting depleted in certain areas because of the globalness of the issue. And so think about a refrigerator or a car. All the components come from so many different places, and some of those components may or may not be available in the right volumes. And that happens at the grocery store as well. This last week we read about the pork facility in eastern U.S., which accounts for 5% of the pork production in the United States, and they're shut down. And you're like, well, it's only 5%, that's all right. Except you got to take that out throughout the supply chain, which means there's just going to be less pork in a lot of grocery stores to accommodate that as the supply chain rebalances. So as that supply chain tries to catch back up in the future, depending on what companies open when and what production looks like and their input processes look like, you could see the market deciding some things should cost more to offset to change the demand function. And so the question is, what things can go up in price and what things can't. So in a magic world, you would go back about 2 months and probably triple the price of toilet paper, right? Because that would have fixed the issue of people buying whole cartloads of it. If it was, $50 a thing at Costco to buy toilet paper, people would have just bought one. That'll happen coming out of this, which is why we're expecting that inflationary pressure to come back into a space where a little higher than we're used to, but not phenomenally.
The picture we've got up now is an early attempt by the folks at the Brookings Institution to look at impacts. And they were saying travel and tourism is going to be hardest hit. Air travel cruise ships, hotels. And so they were they did a map of which metro areas have the higher concentrations of sort of tourism and stand to suffer the most. And they were Orlando, Florida. Las Vegas is the poster child in this conversation. So you will definitely see regional differences in terms of impacts. Houston and other parts of the country in this map too because of energy. And then we have another data source, Chimera Economics, did the same sort of thing, but in their economic vulnerability index, it was both travel tourism and a couple of other indicators, and you still get Vegas, and they're looking at stay at home, stay safe orders. Who's got more restrictive orders? So different attempts to try to guesstimate who gets hit the hardest.
This map gets updated on a regular basis too, and it's available online. If you just Google Chimera Economic
or if
COVID,
email us and we'll send you to the links.
Yeah, that's fine too. But this is open to anybody. You can pull this up and look at this. We've been watching the Washington State counties change colors. For example, Chelan, which is here's a test of geography for everybody. Chelan County is if you come off the side of King and Snohomish counties there, you have Chelan and Douglas counties up there, and those have actually started. One's still pretty bright, but the other one's dimmed back. So the risk factors are starting to drop based on all the conditions. And so we've been watching this map change through time.
Well, and some of the data that feeds into it is the UW's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, right? I mean, all of you have seen the graphics that show how long do you think things are going to be closed? What's the peak look like? What's the duration? And that feeds into a lot of these economic models of impacts. Here was an early version of that, and the expectation, this is now a couple of weeks old, but the expectation was that large events would be canceled for the duration of 2020. And so this was an assumption that concerts, probably large sporting events, UW is looking at this saying, dear God, right? The revenue loss without the football program and some other things is actually striking. Schools are looking at, especially schools like Western Washington University or UW, are saying, not so bad if we can go back to school in the fall. So it's going to be really important in some communities to watch what happens, because if school doesn't open normally, kids aren't going to pay full tuition. So enrollment will drop and so on.
Well, K-12, right? So if K-12 doesn't open in the fall.
Well, that's going to get at some of the topics in just a moment that we want to talk about with this group, because who's taking care of the kids? Who gets stuck at home? Is there's some important sort of household inequality, not just workplace, but just your assumptions about how quickly some of these come back describe whether you're thinking about a V-shaped recovery versus a U versus something else. And just so that everybody knows that James and I talk mostly about something of a U-shaped recovery, with some things opening, crawling back. And if you can get back so that elective surgeries can take place and smaller health clinics can see some patient volume, not back to full necessarily. Courts can start seeing some, so law firms get active again, and so on. Then we'll see what happens. Trying to get away from sort of a public health versus economy, they're part of the same thing. It really bugs me when people.
I think we need to describe shapes, because I have a feeling a lot of these people probably really love their economics classes. So a V shape. When we think about how the recovery works, I want you to think about just a normal line chart. And so we're describing by using letters what we think that line's going to look like over time and what the economy is doing. So a V shape is what you would normally see after a normal disaster. We see disasters all the time, and this is really just a disaster on a global scale. It's not an economic crisis. There's nothing wrong with the economy. Well, nothing that wasn't wrong before. There's nothing wrong with the economy. That's not what caused this. It was a disaster. So it's the same as a hurricane, a tornado, a flood, whatever, just on a global scale. So when we see a disaster, we see a V-shaped recovery. We see the event occur, the economy, localized economy, regional, whatever, comes to an abrupt slowdown and then shoots back up very quickly over time, right? When we go back to 2008, we might talk about I would call it a hockey stick or an L-shaped recovery, where it takes a really long time for us to recover because there's something fundamentally wrong with the economy that's having to be corrected over time. So then we get into Hart and I thinking we're funny and talk about U-shaped or sloppy U's, or where we don't expect to see this sharp return because that's going to depend on a vaccine, right? We can get to a U shape with really good testing, with really good social controls that we're able to manage society in a way where you can get on an airplane, that you could go to a restaurant, that you could send your kids to school with some sense of that the work is being put into place, that you're not more than likely to wind up getting COVID-19 out of it, right? And so that's why we use these shapes to try and shorthand it so people can kind of get their heads around it. But it's that U shape. So the question is, how long is that bottom of that U? And that's the numbers, that's the where we look at the UW modeling. We look at what's going around in the country. We look at the partnership here on the
looking at other countries and see what are they getting recurrence? What's happening as you slowly try to open again? If only we had a really concerted, coordinated effort in testing. But I'll keep my mouth closed on that. So one of the questions that Max and Peter asked us to try to address, the data are limited, and one of the reasons data are limited is that very few states are giving data on who is being affected. So they're not giving the data sorted by gender or race or ethnic group. We have enough information to know that women, for sure, and most minorities are getting hit in two unfortunate ways. We showed the map and we mentioned travel, tourism, food service accommodations. Those sectors are getting hit really hard. You got a lot of women in those sectors. A lot of women suffering because their job is on hold and potentially going to be on hold for a long time. We also have a lot of data that says there's a very large share of women and minorities in what most people are calling frontline workers. Some on the nursing, some on the custodial and different types of healthcare. So you've got women proportionally represented in two of the harder hit. One harder hit on loss of pay, one harder hit on you're going to get to go to work anyway, no matter what the risks are. So really disproportionate impacts if you start looking at gender and minority groups. The data are really sketchy on that right now. There's a little bit of a good summary in a recent New York Times article from late last week. And this graphic is just a snip of the first half, but it's just saying more than half of essential workers are women. And then you see the social and healthcare, critical care, critical retail, all over half, and in some cases 3/4 of those workers are women. They're going to work. Meanwhile, snooty professors are comfortably working from home. Anyway, I didn't need that.
It is a great article. I would encourage you to go and read the article. It's lengthy and full of really good data points that are pretty hard to get.
And I've been trying to collect some articles on what happened and households, people have been having to work from home. Who ends up taking care of the kids? Who's doing both the homeschooling and their job remotely? Falling on women. And then the worry is, what if schools don't start back in the fall? Who's going to bear the brunt? You would like to think shared equally in any given household. Not quite. Really limited data, but what is coming out is not good on the domestic violence front. Increases in domestic violence calls. And again, I mentioned lack of information. We really don't know how disease development, transmission, response to treatment, et cetera, might vary by group. There's some evidence that there are differences in how the disease is affecting different racial groups. So on the sort of social responsibility side, we have a lack of data problem. The data that we do have says issues that really deserve attention. And I threw this last bullet in, high-paying info and professional technical jobs. Circling back, right? You've got people in Seattle, average salary, $240,000 a year, the ability to work at home, really quite easy. So I've got this high-paying job. I get to work safely, no disruption in my pay, compared to all these women who are frontline workers, all these women who've lost their job, people of color who've lost their job. The whole income inequality story that we've been talking about for a number of years, that's getting more pronounced.
Well, you know, you think about those high-paying jobs too. They're living on Grubhub, and who's working at Grubhub? They're relying on all of these other jobs to support them in in that lifestyle, if you will. And so it's definitely causing a deeper divide in the process of who's in these communities and what risks they're facing. One of our student reporters called me the other day, and they wanted to talk to me about how, you know, grocery workers should be receiving, you know, all of this extra money because they should be getting compensated for having these high-risk jobs. And we had to explain, well, this is how the market works. You know, are people going to be willing to spend more on their groceries? Are people going to be willing? Easy conversation, no matter how you slice it, but it's a very important conversation that people get their hands all the way around, so that we don't have, you know, the $15 an hour. That's a red herring. It's not 15. Maybe it's 18. Maybe it's, you know, it's not just that set number. It's something else.
Well, yeah, and you're talking about something that's really, really probably impossible to fix, really hard to fix with a increase in minimum wage. We usually show a slide that shows either productivity over time and wages, or wage growth for different segments. And in either case, it paints a picture that for half or more of Americans, you've had stagnant wage growth for decades and decades. I mean, so this is not a short-term, or recent development. It's not that we're fine and we've just come across this income inequality or affordable housing cliff, and all we have to do is back away from it. It's much more of a systemic issue. I put the wages versus compensation bullet because there are economists and social scientists of particular stripes that say, oh, you don't want to talk about wages when you're looking at income inequality, because compensation packages include healthcare benefits. The overall compensation package has been going up nicely. Healthcare is more expensive. I think wages are a good indicator, and overall income. I'm just putting this out saying from a social responsibility perspective, you've had this long-standing emerging problem, and that what is happening with technology will make it worse, and what is happening with COVID-19 is making it worse. And I think, James, we're probably running out of time. Really quickly.
We get a little more time. We're doing okay, Hart.
Really, really quickly. Part of the Federal Reserve was fantastic. Hidden behind the scenes, or not terribly hidden. When the stock market dropped 30 to 35%, fastest such drop in history. And you gotta love making history. There was a lot of stress in the credit markets that we really could have had another financial crisis. The Federal Reserve stepped in a huge way and very rapidly, taking some of the worst case scenarios off the table. Really remarkable, I would say, very good job from the Fed. We'll let the federal government on the fiscal side argue about small business packages. But anyway, there's a lot of debt now to be dealt with. Some people don't think it matters. I tend to think it will matter. Exactly how it manifests itself, whether it's inflation. Sometimes inflation is in consumer prices. Sometimes it's in asset prices like stocks. There will be an impact of this kind of debt. We don't know whether it's slow growth for a while, but we're conducting a giant monetary experiment on ourselves. It's going to be fun. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. James, I'm going to let you talk more about this, because the main thing I would say is we welcome email conversations. I think some of the work this group is doing is really, really interesting. I'm happy to trade emails with anybody going forward and just trying to help the group. But
so we do a number of things that you may be interested in if this conversation has been interesting to you. The first thing is that we published the Puget Sound Economic Forecaster, which is a quarterly/monthly, it depends on how you subscribe, publication that does a very specific economic forecast for the region that's been publishing for 28 years. So it's I always say it's freakishly accurate, although it certainly didn't see this coming because, well, it doesn't know anything about global health crisis. But we also produce podcasts. We just posted one this week on our website from that. And so we do post those. In theory, we do one once a quarter, but we're kind of on a monthly basis right now just because there's been a lot to talk about. And then we launched Western Insights, which is a every other week webinar series that we're doing. And so you can go to that website and it will, you can see the last two that we published. The first one's just on general economic impacts. If you found this interesting, there's a whole nother session on it. And then we just did one on investing as well, which is interesting. And then the next one.
James, we is not just the two of us.
That is correct. I'm sorry. It is a College of Business and Economics.
And outside speakers.
Venture. Yeah, so we have outside speakers and people from on campus as well. So those are different ways to get some insights there. Our center works much like I don't know, I'll say consulting firm and then say not really. But we do offer custom research services on just about anything the university touches. So it could be economics, public opinion. We do have, lab sciences, those kinds of things as well. We've done a little bit of work around those things. And so it's a multidisciplinary approach. And so it's
with students.
With students, that's correct. So applied research essentially is the way to describe that. But it's an opportunity if you or someone you're working with is looking for a good research partner. That's something we like to find those opportunities. And then we also have a very active social media stream, and you can pick your vice there. We got four channels to choose from. They all have the same content, so you don't have to pick more than one. And you can link to those from our website. So, but we post right now. We're doing about 6 articles a day, and they're different things we find from the media stream. So we referenced a couple articles here today. We're posting those every day. We also post every weekend. We post a week in review, kind of a wrap up as well, that gives all kinds of metrics from the last week that you can look at. And of course, most of this stuff is all free. So it's definitely, if you've got a hankering for some economics, then it's a good way to grab hold of those. Hart and I love getting emails. You can never get enough emails, right, Hart?
I like emails. I don't do Facebook or the Twitter, and I'm a Luddite.
That's right. But so definitely you can reach out to us later if you have a question, and we can stumble our way through an answer for that. So
yeah,
we are ready to jump into questions. Hart, are you ready?
Be careful for what you ask, but Yeah.
All right. How quickly do we see the economy return? And as it does, do we see income inequality declining or expanding?
Oh, you're gonna make me go first on that one.
Uh-huh.
Our first Western Insight webinar, I was coming across as the optimist. I was assuming a pretty concerted effort at testing, at getting testing volume dramatically increased, strategies that would let us test randomly. I'm just not a fan of saying, "Oh, do you have a temperature?" Uh, as a because I saw testing as possible and as a way of getting the economy going again in steps, small steps. The longer we've gone without any real effort in a coordinated way to do that, we're leaving it to businesses to figure out whether they can track or not, Google and Apple working together instead of with any guidance. I'm a little bit more pessimistic. So we talked about a U-shaped recovery. The longer we go, the more I'm anticipating a lot of schools staying remote in the fall. I really need somebody on the healthcare side to help me think through how much can we open without putting sort of a resurgence in the virus back in play and having to shut down again. God, so much uncertainty. But the second part of the question, I see income inequality and some of the other related equity issues being magnified by this. So in the near term, I think they're worse. My hope is that because they're so bloody obvious, they get more policy attention.
I would take it that and say I'm skeptical about school in the fall. We're getting hints from out of OSPI that they're unsure about school in the fall. And Chris Rickdahl has been pretty, I don't know, he's dropped a lot of hints. And so I really do suspect that we're going to see.
And you're thinking K-12 with that.
Well, let's talk K-12 first. So I'm expecting K-12 to not be open in the fall. And if they do open for the fall, it's going to be a week or a 2 week here or there. It's not going to be welcome back to school, let's roll. I do think they'll be back by January. I do think we'll be back to that. I think most universities will probably also follow that lead. None of them are. I mean, there's been a handful at this point that have said they're going to stay remote through fall quarter. Most of them in our state, on the other hand, have said they're watching the situation. So
well, they're watching because school doesn't start until late September, and they're hoping there's enough development instead of they're not a Labor Day start. They're on the quarter system, so they're hedging a lot. But
I think we watch Wazoo, to be very honest, because they're an August start. I think if Wazoo decides they're going to stay remote, I think they all will. So I think that's your canary is Wazoo. It's probably one of the only times I can say Wazoo will go first. So, sorry. Let's see here. How do we see the state's ability to support the most vulnerable being impacted by the rate of economic return?
I'm not sure about the second half of the question. The state's support of the most vulnerable?
I guess whoever asked that question, I'd like a little more information.
I feel like it's going to be hard. Public support. I mean, how you had Mitch McConnell come out today and say he favors letting the states declare bankruptcy. City of Kent talking layoffs. Whatcom County just starting to talk layoffs. Remember that a large portion of the revenues in Olympia are sales tax. There's other than toilet paper and marijuana, people haven't stocked up a great deal. Sales tax receipts have to be down dramatically.
Day drinking is way up. I saw a study yesterday. Day drinking, 40% of people surveyed reported they're drinking during the day. So drinking and marijuana is up. What could possibly go wrong? Seems our state, city, and county governments are overspending any revenue. What can be done at any level? I think we're going to have a very interesting chat coming up soon about taxes.
No,
And what,
the state was already working on some studies to look at whether or not they should switch in several years, or what is not switch, whether they should have a vote in several years on implementing an income tax versus a sales tax. But it's back to the debt story. Not only is the federal states can't take on debt with balanced budget requirements at the municipal and state level the way the federal government can. I mean, you're heading towards some fiscal roadblocks that are going to be very hard, and I think those two questions are pointing out that the lack of revenue at the state level will stop states. The state or some of the cities won't have the ability to pay for essential services for vulnerable populations.
so Howard, I think this is something you and I talk about a lot. Given what we talked about in terms of geographic variance and economic variability across the state, we could even say across the country, how do we anticipate the recovery going? Is it likely to be concentrated in high-resourced areas or households? And I think that's been the story since 2008.
Oh, before.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting in that rural areas won't be hit nearly as hard by the virus, but the economic drivers in most areas. The recovery from the 2008-9 recession has been a superstar city story. Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, Boston, slowly spilling out to Salt Lake. More recently, Boise. I should have put Denver in that early one. Those cities will probably bounce back quicker than most because some people can continue to work remotely. They can distance. The jobs, cloud computing, technology, communication, what's going to happen in business travel, what's going to happen with education, the technology disruptions that are going to be occurring because of what we're going through mean the job growth at Microsoft or Adobe and the Zooms of the world. Yeah, those cities come back. I think it accelerates or accentuates some of the patterns that we've seen for the last decade and more.
So there's a book on our bookshelf in the office, which someday we'll be able to go back, but The New Geography of Jobs. And that's a little bit what Hart's talking about here. It's a great read around how this economic disparity has happened out of the recovery and actually going back into the 70s. So when Hart's mentioned this challenges for decades, we're really talking about the 70s. So 50 years, this spread has been happening. This isn't a new problem. It's just gotten to a point where it's affecting a critical mass of people in a way that we're paying attention to it. Hart, there's a couple comments in here about, I mean, we brought up taxes, and is this going to cause us to look at how our taxes are done and the equity of tax structures? I'm thinking of Dick Conway's article we posted and the work. Maybe you can talk. Can you say anything about kind of that body of work?
Well, I'm pausing because we're obviously seeing what was the expression that the economy is on a induced coma, and so spending in a lot of areas has stopped, and so that means retail sales have stopped, and the state definitely looks at how regressive is a sales tax compared to a income tax. How much more volatile is our retail sales, B&O, and property tax sort of package compared to what other states have with a mix of income and other things? And you have to remember that if the stock market goes down sharply, so does dividend income, so does some other things. It's going to be interesting to see which tax structures hold up better through this sort of cycle, if you will, because it's one more data point on which tax structure funds public services best. I think the regressivity matters a lot, and that's an important question that Dick Conway was getting at. Bill Gates Sr. back in 2001 was head of a committee that did a report, and it doesn't seem to get enough traction. It's starting to worrying about how regressive our tax structure is, and how do you address that? But so the Department of Revenue has a team working on that now. This is more data for it, but some good research going on in that area.
And if anyone's interested in that article that Dick Conway wrote, we certainly can share that. So you can send us a note and we'd be happy to do that. But he's done quite a bit of research around tax regressiveness and looking at that data.
He's not a fan of the tax system we have right now.
No, not at all. No. Had several questions in here about homelessness. How are they included or excluded from economic disparity discussion? How does homelessness wrap into some of the data points that we've been looking at here?
Oh, geez. The homeless, one of the easiest ways to sort of sum that up, to be counted in the unemployment statistics, you have to be considered part of the labor force. So we know who's in the military. We know who's incarcerated. We know who's working. We know who's not working but looking for work because they're filling out forms. They're either getting unemployment insurance or payments from the state. So we know something about the unemployed. But if you step out of the labor force, if you're not working and you're not looking for work in a way that lets you get counted, you vanish. You're not in any of the statistics. So go ahead.
One of the statistics I watch is the labor force participation rate. So you're used to unemployment, right? That's what Hart described. And there's several different unemployment metrics, and we won't go down that rabbit hole. But the labor force participation is essentially all of the working aged people as the denominator, and the numerator is the people that are actually employed, right? So right now, I'm trying to remember where we're at, Hart, with that number. Is it 60% or something?
Low 60s, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but that number's been dropping. So fewer, the way you want to say that is, fewer people of working age are going to work in the United States. Now, why aren't they going to work? Well, some of them are unemployed, all right. Some of them could be incarcerated, all right. Some of them could have worked at Microsoft and retired at 32. Some of them were, 58 and decided to retire early. So we can't unpack it very well into that, but the number's dropping, and that's changing the way the workforce looks.
Well, it's been dropping for years for men, going up for women, and both seem to have plateaued. But I think where you're going with that is part of the story of the declining labor force participation has to be increase in homelessness, increase in just being disenfranchised altogether.
And then also automation. That is, automation comes in theory, more people would find themselves finding jobs that have better wages as well, because you're changing the way the workforce works. But that's not a overnight kind of a thing. I mean,
there is attempts to collect some data. Project Homeless Connect, different cities or counties go out and try to survey the homeless population in their area to get counts, to get information on them. So there's some data there. Oh God, there's a long conversation, well, many conversations to be had around homelessness, mental health, and so on. A certain lack of information connecting healthcare demands, coordinated health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to go there, but I don't think we have. They want to invite us back.
So,
James and Hart, I just want to jump in and make sure that we have time for the rest of our agenda. So I hate to stop the flow of conversation. And I know that we have questions that we haven't been able to get to in the comments. So we will compile these questions and forward them to you if you're comfortable with that. And we'll put a link again to your emails so that we can, so folks can follow up individually with you as well.
We love to follow up with people. Hope we didn't ramble too far afield.
No, I'm so glad we could get through some of the questions, but there's definitely more conversation to be had in this discussion. So if Max is on the line, I'm going to head over to him. Thank you both again, and thank you everyone for your questions. Max is going to talk to us now about ways to get involved in our program, as well as our evolving COVID response at WPSR. So
I'm going to sign off, but Max and Tasia, Peter, look forward to talking to you all some more. I'd love to learn more about the group and see if we can connect.
Thanks, Hart. Thank you, James.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hart. Thank you, James. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you everybody for being here. Thanks to our presenters. I just had to make one comment, which is that last week I had a long conversation with the guy that just got mentioned a couple of times, Dick Conway, and he's a retired economist. He was the founder of that publication that now is in the hands of the Center for Economic and Business Research at WW. And one of the most interesting things that I think comments that he had was that tax systems are moral systems and that budgets are moral documents. And I think that as we've been looking at how the tax system has negatively impacted the state's ability to provide for basic needs, and how the impacts on the budget now and the state budgets are going to really impact people. That's been something that's on the forefront of our minds at WPSR as we think about how to approach the issue, the crisis of COVID. It's the way that it has been highlighting and fast exacerbating economic inequity in our state and around the country and the world. So in addition to continuing apace on our programs that aim to address grave threats to public health, we are also turning our attention to this crisis, which is also impacting public health very directly. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about what we're doing in that regard, and talk a little bit about some things going on with our program and how you all can get involved if you are not already. So needless to say, as an organization of health professionals, the crisis has been of extreme and sort of special concern to us, both because many of our members and volunteers and donors are people who are working on the front lines of the crisis now, and really in the thick of what's going on, and many are putting themselves at great risk to take care of our community. So one of our priorities in the short term is to try to advocate for the needs of the healthcare community itself, and to really put that as a priority in the short term. In the medium term, as an advocacy organization, we will be focusing on advocating for policies that ensure the provision of basic needs of the many people who are really struggling to meet those basic needs. And that is a crisis that probably everybody knows people and who are being affected by that. And it's a crisis that is very immediate, but we expect it to last for quite some time. But as an organization that tends to focus on upstream sort of policy solutions to some of these societal problems, I think that our biggest concern is about how our society, how our economy will emerge from this crisis over time in a way that is just and equitable and changes the landscape that has gotten us into this mess, certainly in economic terms, but also in terms of health. So all of that said, our economic and equity program, like our other programs, works with a task force model. We have a team of people made up of health professionals and other concerned people from the community who care about public health and care about these issues we work on, who help to guide our sort of strategy in terms of how we're going to respond, what policies we're going to advocate for, and mobilizing a real diverse group of health professionals, not only physicians, despite our name, to advocate and to move the dial on policy, to influence decision makers, and to educate the public about how we can address these issues. And for this particular issue on economic inequity, that is to try to address policies like progressive taxation and tax reform and social spending that can mitigate inequity, because we believe what we know is a fact, and hence is easy to believe, which is that economic inequity is a really powerful driver of health disparities. So all of that said, for those of you who are not familiar with our program or our work, I want to encourage you to both visit our website, to use the link that should be in the chat to sign up for emails, which we send out in what I hope is not an oppressive way, but occasionally to provide people with some information about what is going on in the sort of ecosystem of economic inequity and health, particularly in Washington, and to provide people with opportunities to support some of the calls to action and advocacy that we're getting behind to try to address this issue, particularly now as it's on the forefront of everybody's minds. Other ways that you can get involved in our work is, of course, to become a member of our organization. We're about 1,000 people strong across the state of Washington and outside the state too. A real mix of health professionals, physicians, nurses, and many other people who care about the work we're doing, the issues we work on, and the fact that they are issues that impact societal health, things that affect everybody. So we have a real diverse and inclusive group of members and volunteers who work on these issues, and we really want you to be involved in that work. So different ways to do that are, in addition to signing up to be a member or to volunteer, also include being a member of our task forces, and we're now recruiting some members to be part of the task force that will be working on the issue of economic inequity. And if that is something that you are passionate about, or you bring some expertise in some of the areas that I was talking about, particularly in taxation or some of the core issues around social spending, education, labor, homelessness, food security, those are things that we're really looking for. And I just encourage you to learn more, reach out to any of us who are on the call, myself, Tasia, Mark, our president, and we'd love to talk to you more about that. In short order, we're also going to be putting out a petition that we're looking to get 1,000 health professionals to sign, that will be advocating for a sort of a just and equitable response to the COVID recovery. We want to really use what sometimes I call as our secret sauce or our special sauce, which is adding the voice of health professionals to some of the key issues that we're advocating for. And as many of you know, the voice of people who work in the health fields have special weight and power when we put them in front of decision makers and policymakers. So I hope that you'll all look for that and not only sign it, but share it with your colleagues and coworkers, because we want to make the voice of healthcare professionals heard in the halls of power in our state as decisions get made about how our state, our communities, our economy will not only emerge from this crisis quickly, but in a way that will be fair and give the attention and the deserved resources to those who are suffering the most and who are most vulnerable, and to create a system that will protect them as we emerge from that crisis. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time if anybody had questions to ask, or they could be about the presentation, or if you wanted to share some information you had or resources, we'd love to hear from you. And I will quiet myself now. Thank you all so much again for joining us tonight. You can type questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you know how to do that.
Max, if I can have a minute or two, in the chat box, I tried to get the economists to consider whether mortality is pro-cyclical. So business cycles, they have booms and busts. And studies going back to the 1800s show that when the economy is booming, mortality rates go up, in contrast to when the economy is tanking, when mortality rates go down. This was certainly true in the Great Depression. It's been true in many studies around the world. And so there's perhaps a silver lining in this whole thing. So back in 2009, with the subprime mortgage crisis, I was quite scared and wondering what was going to happen. And so I began reviewing the literature and wrote a review paper on that, which I attached in the chat box there. It's a finding that, is it going to happen now with our current pandemic? I don't know. It hasn't failed us yet in a very long time. The procyclical nature of mortality varies in amplitude throughout countries. In countries with a lot of government-funded social support, the difference in mortalities between booms and busts are smaller than they are in countries such as the United States, where we only give social support to the rich and powerful. So I anticipate that there may be a real silver lining in this whole process. Now, I always come up with heretical ideas, but that one has a lot of literature to support it. And I notice, Charles Mayer talked about a study in Israel that found that when doctors go on strike, mortality declines. And I posted a review paper on the chat box by somebody else that describes this phenomenon. So, if, as Thomas Pynchon wrote in Gravity's Rainbow, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. And we got to ask better questions.
Thanks, Stephen. There is a question from Charles Mayer. Are there opportunities to go to Olympia to advocate for progressive taxation this summer? That is a great question. I do not yet know the answer definitively to that. I believe that there's talk about having a special session of the legislature sometime later in the summer, but I don't believe that's been decided yet. And we are still sort of learning about how, as an advocacy organization, how to effectively connect with, work, lean on our elected officials, since they are all operating quite differently. So I think we'll be looking at that and making sure to reach out to everybody as we figure out whether we're going to be able to do in-person constituent advocacy with our members of Congress on some of these issues, or take different approaches to that. I'm just looking back to see if any other questions here. How to get involved. Thanks, Robin. So yeah, as I mentioned, for those of you who want to be informed about what we're doing, including our calls to action, and I guess one of the points to make for those of you who are interested in being involved in our work is that you can be involved sort of as little as much as you like. We put out calls to action, and we need folks to do things as simple as signing petitions, signing onto letters, sending notes to members of Congress. But we also mobilize health professionals to give public talks, to give public comment and testimony, and definitely to go to Olympia or to in-district meetings with legislators. So as issues come up, as legislators move around, and as there are opportunities for us to use really your voices, because I'm not the health professional here, we put out those calls to our people on this list of folks interested in supporting our advocacy work on economic inequity. So you can reach out to us and let us know, and we can try to plug you into the things that are most meaningful to you and that fit with what are, for most of you, busy and these days extra busy lives. If, as Hart was saying, you're home trying to work full time and maybe take care of kids and other things as well. So thanks for that question, Robin. My pleasure. Tasia, do you want to say a couple words about follow-up? Oh, before that, here's a question from Jesse. How was the response to your recent op-ed? The response to the recent op-ed, I'm going to pop the link to that here in the chat. So yeah, about 2 weeks ago, we put an op-ed into the Seattle Times in response to their editorial calling on the governor to make budget cuts, which he promptly did. I don't know if that was in response to the editorial or pressure to cut the budget, but really talking about how right now is no time to be cutting the budget. What we really need is to address our state's revenue issues through taxation and other sources of revenue for a budget that's already underfunded. So the response to that was, it was polarized, I guess I would say, probably no surprise, but we got some incredible feedback. A lot of people reached out to, to thank us for that, made some really good connections and some people who I think are drawn to our program because they realized the kind of work that we're doing on this in conjunction with a lot of partner organizations around the region. But I think if you look, which I haven't looked at in a while, in the comments under the article or under our op-ed, there was quite a bit of vitriol in response to that, which I would say that for us was an indication of success. I heard that there were plenty of people panning it on Twitter and such also. And again, I think that meant that we're sort of hitting the chords that we would expect and want to hit, because I think it's an issue that really needs to, it is a difficult issue. It's going to require difficult changes. That's why it has not been changed for many, many, many decades in our state, and why we're at the bottom of the list when it comes to progressive taxation here. So I think it's going to be a real uphill battle, and but that's the battle that we're in, and we recognize that there are extremely entrenched interests that for whom this system is working extremely well. I think some of them were getting highlighted in the presentation, so anyway, we hope you'll join us in trying to make a call and make I think a really rational argument about why this is critical. And I think many people feel like, one of the silver linings of this crisis might be that the problems of taxation and revenue in our state, as well as the problems of how people are, who are already suffering from inequality, are suffering more now and are going to continue to suffer if those kind of structural issues don't get addressed in relatively short order. Well, here's a question for Danny. Danny, I don't know if you're still on the call, but there was a question about, the kudos for your op-ed and a question about the response. I don't know if you want to jump on and respond to that. I'm going to unmute you.
Yeah, I can unmute. I guess I assume this one is in referencing the Crosscut article, because I have another one. I don't know if it came out. That's supposed to come out in the Seattle Times today or tomorrow. But I presume this one is regarding how race needs to be accounted for in COVID response. And everything I've heard from that has been generally pretty positive. I think the difference between Crosscut and the Seattle Times, there's no comment specifically below it. The Seattle Times, unfortunately, I tried to submit it to them and they weren't interested at the time. But I think it's been shared on social media a fair amount. It's an issue that started to gain traction much more so because in the Midwest, folks were actually measuring race data. So throughout, initially it was kind of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Chicago had some race data, and then out of Louisiana, and New Orleans as well. So unfortunately, most of the country has not really measured, or at least if they have, they will have not publicly published different outcomes on race in the COVID pandemic. So I think there's going to be a lot to come, but we're obviously seeing both from an income perspective and a racial breakdown of our society and the inequities that we all know exist, and how those are just being exacerbated. So I think it's been a well-received, but also question of kind of who is reading it and how is that different? Are we reaching different audiences? Because I think that's always an important aspect too. And why I think some of the vitriol that Max was just referring to is actually helpful, is, or at least showing that you are reaching folks with different opinions. And I think Crosscut's a great publication, but it also caters more to a crowd that might agree with those points. And so trying to find outlets and talk to people from other perspectives.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Max, did you have anything else you wanted to touch on tonight?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody again so much for your interest, for taking time to listen to our presenters, and Tasia will talk a little bit about some next steps and how we'll follow up with everybody, since I know we had questions that we didn't get to today, and some folks might want to pass on some of the information from the call tonight to other folks you know. So thanks again. Please reach out to any of us anytime with questions to find out how to get involved, and hopefully you will sign up so we can be in touch with all of you about some of the actions we'll be taking and looking for support for in the weeks and months to come.
Great, thank you, Max. So I'm just going to post again our listserv link. So please sign up if you haven't already. That's the best way to stay connected as we move forward with our rapidly and evolving response to COVID. I've also put up Max and I's emails, so please feel free to reach out to us. And we will, I believe this is being recorded, so we will send out a recording of this meeting, and we'll compile the questions and send them on to our presenters. And their individual emails are in the agenda document, so please also feel free to reach out to them individually. I think that concludes our meeting for tonight, unless there are any further comments or questions.
Just thank you all for arranging quite an interesting meeting. I wonder if they would be willing to make their slides available.
We will ask them to do that and follow up in an email. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. And
Stay healthy. Stay in touch.
Yeah, exactly. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.